having children has slipped too low down the priority list. The cohort of the grandchildren is a third of the size of the parents, and that's a third of the size of the grandparents. So that's a society that goes into freefall.
Elon Musk,
he talks about it as the most important issue facing humanity. But if you look at the people on the one-time heroes of the left, Stalin, Mao, Castro, they're all pro-natalists. And the left has suddenly decided, to be pro-natal is to be a fascist.
Yeah.
That shows no sense of history, but the woke left has decided just to shut their eyes to that and say, if you're pro-natalist, you must be far right.
Am I a problem here?
You're totally part of the problem.
Yes.
But good news is it's not too late. And if we're going to get over this hump, if we're going to solve the problem, children have got to go up the priority list. But now we've gone down to super low. So it's not just because we're all reasonably educated, and it's not just because we're all reasonably wealthy, and it's not just because most of us live in cities. Something more than that is happening.
Are we doomed?
No.
Okay. Might we be doomed?
Yes.
What's happening?
We're not having enough children. That was at one point the privilege of wealthy Europeans. It became the privilege of Europeans more generally and North Americans. And now the trend to have far too few children to replicate ourselves has spread to quite distant and quite poor countries. In Thailand, in parts of India, they have lower fertility rates than we have. And if you go generation after generation, having less than a couple of kids per couple, then the population will eventually start falling, and it will fall and fall and fall and fall. It will age. That's really problematic, and we'll come on to talk about that. But even apart from the aging, if we never get back to replacement fertility rates, community after community, country after country, society after society will shrink away. The reason I don't think we're necessarily doomed is because somewhere someone is having children. The question is who, where, and why, I suppose.
Bloody, and that's going to change the whole demographics.
Well, if it carries on the current trajectory, then certainly outside sub-Saharan Africa, which is the last place where people are having really substantially sized families, the sorts of people who have big families in London, in New York, in rural America, are people who are not part of very mainstream society. And those communities will grow, and the kind of secular, mainstream, liberal community will wane. And what sort of society we'll end up with, whether there'll be some kind of overarching narrative, some overarching state, I don't know.
Interesting. Won't those people being born in those places then move to the cities, and then this sort of stays the same in that sense?
Well, the cities have always been a bit of a consumer of people. So if you go back to the 18th century, people had large families in the UK, for example, and many people went to London and they died at London. London had a very high death rate. It was very dirty and diseased, and people didn't have many children. So the cities were kind of sinks in a way. In a high fertility society, they would absorb people to the bright lights of London, the kind of London of Handel and Dr. Johnson, which is a pretty grubby place, and they didn't live very long. And in a way, liberal society has become a bit like that. It will eventually be sucking in the children of high fertility communities and possibly converting them to their way of life and low fertility. Or alternatively, the societies which have high fertility will hold on to their children and they will become predominant. So there are two models. There's a model of high fertility societies where they hold on to their kids and those societies grow and grow and grow. And there's another model where those high fertility societies like the Amish, for example, continue to produce lots of children, but lose them to the bright lights in the big city and the secular liberal world where they in turn have low fertility. Two models for the future.
And we don't know which one yet.
No, some societies are better at keeping their young than others. So, for example, I write and talk a lot about this subject, and I got an email back about 3 or 4 months ago from a woman who said, Dr. Morland, I like your stuff, I'm very interested in it, but you don't talk enough about traditional Catholics. I'm one of 5, my brother's got 11, my sister's got 12, my other brother's got 15, and so I only have 3 because I started late in life. So she was saying, why don't you talk about traditional Catholics? I think the thing about traditional Catholics, because Catholicism evolved as a majority religion. Catholics can live anywhere, they can travel to Mass, they don't live in closed communities. And so, whilst I wish the best of luck to her brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces, I think an awful lot of them will effectively leave that community. I think to make a really powerful demographic impact in the developed world, where general background fertility is low and your fertility is high, you've got to hold on to those kids generation after generation. Because at the moment, those high fertility groups are really, really small. But with exponential growth, they might grow 3% a year while the rest of society is shrinking. So they could become quite predominant. But only that kind of compound growth will only happen if they manage to find ways of holding on to their young. So I think the big challenge for them is how did they hold on to their young? The big challenge for the rest of us, which I think is more pertinent and probably we should be spending a bit more time talking about, is how we get the general fertility rate of society up, say in the UK, from the 1.6, 1.7 it is today, to somewhere between 2 and 3, so that we can have a bright future, we can have plenty of young people, we can have people entering the workforce, we don't become massively dependent on mass immigration. We have a younger society, and we can stop worrying about all the kind of problems that I spend my time talking about.
Am I part of the problem? Because I'm 34, I don't have kids, my fiance is nearly 30, and is doing a law training degree thing. You know, she's we've got to do a couple of years more of that, another couple, you know, and that kind of thing. Am I a problem here?
You're totally part of the problem.
Yes.
But good news is it's not too late.
Before you can say good news, it's her fault.
Good news is it's absolutely not her fault. The good news is you found each other and you got married, I believe, which is nice. Or you're getting married, but you've coupled up. And I would just suggest don't leave it too long. If we're here in 10 years' time and you ask the same question, I'd say, yes, you are part of the problem and there's not much you can do about it at this stage.
Are people delaying, though, because of work? I mean, what are some of the reasons that we're having fewer children? So
in traditional societies, people have lots of children. As we know, there's a high mortality rate in traditional societies, and going back to Britain of 1800, say, and much of the world until 70, 80 years ago, 2/3 of kids didn't make it to reproducing themselves. And people had very large families. And then 3 things happen. You get urbanization, you get education, and you get a rise in income. And so what happens is death rates fall, population grows, and then birth rates come down to something like 2. And 2 or 3 is fine in a society where you're not losing your kids, where there's low infant mortality rates, and infant mortality rates are extremely low in developed countries. So we can afford to say we don't need to have 6 or 7 children, with 2/3 of them dying, thank goodness. Most of our kids are going to make it, and so 2 to 3 is fine. And that's where Britain was in the 60s. Early 70s. But now we've gone down to super low. So it's not just because we're all reasonably educated, and it's not just because we're all reasonably wealthy, and it's not just because most of us live in cities. Something more than that is happening, something deeply cultural. And I think it's about the priorities people have in their lives. And it's not to say they don't want children, but they've just got a lot of other things they want to do. And if we're going to get over this hump, if we're going to solve the problem, children have got to go up the priority list.
Do you think it might relate to the status game? This idea that, you know, I get my status from having a podcast. A lot of people, I know this, people are going to be annoyed, but people get annoyed when I say this, but some people get status through their children. They live vicariously. I'm not saying everyone does, but a lot of people do, and that's a status in itself. And then I've noticed that so many people who are very ambitious about various other things suddenly drop those other things once they've had kids, and that's what their Instagram's about. That's what all the is there a status thing, and do we then need to make children about status?
I am not a psychologist, but I think you may be onto something. So I think what we do need to do, whether you call it status or priority, I think having children and being parents at a reasonably young age has to be something that's cool. And I think it has to be something that you can find a way in modern society to combine with aspiration, with education. I'm not saying anybody should give up the chance of a decent career or the chance of a decent education. I'm simply saying, how do we work into that, reproducing ourselves as a society? I don't particularly like the term status. I'm not saying it's wrong, but that almost feels like you're having children to show off. But I would like people to say, I'm really proud of the fact that in my early 20s or my mid-20s, or even my late 20s, I started to reproduce, and I've got these kids. They're the most important thing to me. And yes, I've also got my job. Maybe I've got my podcast. Maybe I've got my 5-a-side stock, whatever it is. People have loads of things they get on with in their lives and loads of priorities. I just think that having children has slipped too low down the priority list, and that's why it gets delayed. And then if you delay it long enough, it becomes difficult. Then we rely on the technology, which is very expensive. It's not always very reliable. The chances of having a child naturally in your late 20s are much higher than trying in your 40s with IVF. So I'm not sure about the word status, but I do think it is about people's psychology. It's about their priorities. And there's a very deep question about why that's changed and why we have such a low level of aspiration to have children. And again, that's complex, it's psychological, it's almost beyond my scope. What I can say is that it is something about priorities, that we are having too few children and that we'd better fix it. And that is something we can all be doing something about. The government has a role, but it's not just about throwing more money at it.
I suppose part of the reason I think of status is the decline in religion, and religion now is seen as not cool, I think, anyway. And I'm not religious myself, so I don't think religion is cool, but people once did. And a big part of religious communities, and tell me if I'm wrong, I don't know, but I feel like they have lots of babies. That's a big part of the religion and the culture and things. And now that's out. That's having kids is almost like it feels like, oh, what are you? Are you religious or something? People want to maybe distance themselves from that.
So two things, the relationship between religion and having children, and then whether we can have a secular society and have a lot higher fertility rate. So what we call the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all have a pro-natal tendency. Now, there's actually more complexity in that than it appears. So, for example, in Christianity, there is a monastic tradition. Christian societies had a lower fertility rate when lots of people were going into monasteries and nunneries and priests couldn't get married and so on. I mean, we all know what was going on in the Middle Ages, and celibacy vows weren't always adhered to, but still, if you take a whole chunk of people out of your reproductive pool, then you do end up with a lower fertility rate than you'd have otherwise. So Christianity is generally pro-natal. More religious Christian people definitely have larger families, but it's not totally simplistic. Neither in Islam is it totally simplistic, and certainly Islam generally is fairly relaxed about the use of contraception, for example. Both Judaism and Islam are not nearly as anti-abortion as Catholicism. It's a complex picture. But what we find in those societies which have traditionally been Christian, Muslim or Jewish is that where fertility rates come down, they come down more slowly. And they have actually gone very low in places like Italy, for example, but it's been a more gradual fall. And within the society, the more religious definitely have more children. And we know this, for example, work in America shows very clearly religious attendance or religiosity correlates with higher family size. Israel, which is the only country in the OECD with above replacement fertility rate, you can simply have a spectrum of how people identify by 5 or 6 religious categories, and the more religious, the larger families they have. So that's that we know. What's different, though, is Buddhism and Hinduism don't seem to have that effect. And so what seems to be happening in Buddhist countries particularly, but also now in India, is that the fertility rate's falling very fast. Generally, when you get to a level of development, you go through what we've said, the death rate falls, eventually the fertility rate falls, population goes up, and then its growth slows down. India's really falling very fast. Countries like Thailand, China, Japan have seen very, very fast falling and very low fertility rates. Korea, which has got a fairly recent evangelical tradition, but is essentially not a Abrahamic faith tradition, is a country where the fertility rate is now 0.8. So each or 0.7 even now.
That's very low, isn't it?
It means each cohort's a third of the size of the last one. That means that the cohort of the grandchildren is a third of the size of the parents, and that's a third of the size of the grandparents. So that's a society that goes into freefall. And nothing quite as dramatic's happened in countries which at least have that Abrahamic tradition. So that's really nice to know, but then there's a kind of so what? And as someone who's advocating that we have more children, I can't tell everybody get religious. That's not... I think religion has pros and cons. I'm relatively religious myself and relatively observant, but that's I'm
faith?
Jewish.
Oh,
that's a personal preference and probably does relate to my pronatalism. But I'm not going to go around the world telling people that they have to be religious any more than I'm going to tell them they have to have children. There's clearly a correlation. So I think what we have to get to is the following. Traditional societies had higher fertility rates. Religious societies have higher fertility rates. We are moving into a secular world. We are moving into a world where most people are not religious. And I don't see that changing. There are some indications of a growth in religiosity in certain societies, but in most societies, we see secularization. We see a high level of female aspiration. We see a degree of feminism, and all of those things I am open to and welcome. I don't particularly want to live in a theocracy. I don't want to live in a world where the opportunities of my daughters were any less than the opportunity for my son. So I'm not resisting those things, but my challenge back to people who lead those lifestyles is, how do you reconcile those things with having enough children that we have a future as a society? How can we have a society where we're not relying on religion to have more children? How can we have a society where women are equal and they have full opportunities in the workplace, and yet they find time within their working lives, and their husbands do, to have children? So, for example, my older daughter, both my daughters had children last year. My older daughter's gone back to work at the beginning of January. Now her husband's taking paternity leave for 3 months. It's got to be more equal, not necessarily 50-50 because of the breastfeeding and all sorts of biological things. She took 9 months, he's taking 3 months. But I think if we've got to imagine and recreate a future where an equal opportunities world and a secular world is a world where people still have 2 to 3 children. And I'm not saying 6 or 7. I'm just saying 2 to 3. That doesn't seem crazy to me. That seems achievable. But there are many places in the world that are achieving it.
I don't remember the last time I had this conversation with a friend who said, yeah, I'd like 3 or 4. I don't remember last time I heard that. It tends to be 2. Most people have concerns about, an only child. But it appears that a lot of people are still having only children. If we're at below 2 per couple, there must be a lot of people with just 1 child, or is there a lot of zeros?
There are loads of zeros. So there's been a huge rise in the zeros, but there's also been a drop-off. I mean, there's been a corresponding drop-off. As you've got more zeros, there's been a corresponding drop-off in the 1s and the 2s and the 3s and the 4s, more or less in balance in most societies. But obviously, lots of people can't have children. Lots of people really don't want them. And again, I would rather we cease to exist as a species than that anyone gets forced to have children. That's not what I'm talking about. So people are going to opt out. So for everyone who opts out or can't or doesn't want, whatever the reason is, I think it's important that the rest of us do a little bit more, which is why I've got 3. I think 3 is a good number. 4 would have been very nice. I'll see how many my children have. Certainly one of them wants to have quite a large family. What can you do when you've got a pro-natalist as a dad? Where you can react, pressure. Of course. None of them have, and they're not really under particular pressure. But what I'd like to see is a world where we're not going back to the 1950s or the 1850s or the 1550s. We don't need to do that in order to have 2 or 3 children per couple. That just doesn't seem to me irreconcilable. It shouldn't be irreconcilable if we get our priorities right, if we have the right dialogue, if government can actually get its backside into gear and do something about it, and actually as a society we pick up the challenge. We have icons. I often talk about David Beckham, Prince William. They're not talking endlessly about how we need to have more children. I don't think either of them ever made a comment on the subject. They probably have massively more impact on people perceiving having children as a good thing to do than my endless witterings and scribblings.
Well, don't underestimate your scribblings, but Elon Musk.
Yeah,
another one.
I mean, I'm really pleased he's taking this issue very seriously, and he talks about it as the most important issue facing humanity. He's a bit marmitey, though. The fact that he's picked it up is maybe putting some people off. I don't know. I think one thing that's really interesting, though, is how talking about it has really upset certain people. So I wrote an article in the Sunday Times about a year and a half ago saying we need to have more children. And there are a whole range of things I was suggesting. One of the things I suggested we might do is have a differential tax system, as they have in many parts of the world, in France, in Cuba, in countries of the left, countries to the right, where they say that just as we have benefits, which are child benefits, we could have a differential tax system. So you get extra tax breaks if you've got children and pay a bit more if you haven't. Fortunately or unfortunately, that was headlined, "Is it time to tax the childless?" But I don't use that.
Oh, no.
But it got lots of publicity. But anyway, it caused a lot of ire. A lot of people got really angry. And I think a lot of people get very uncomfortable.
So I'm just writing down that title as a suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for this video,
okay.
Is it time
to tax the childless? So a lot of people got very upset. And it seems to be a red rag to a bull, even to discuss these things. And Miriam Cates, the MP, who's a sort of great ally on this subject and has spoken out about it, is a very courageous woman. I heard her on the radio the other day, and the interviewer was saying, I think it was Evan Davis, I can't remember, was saying, "Don't you find people react in a bad way and you need to be quite courageous to talk about this?" And she said, "Yes, I am sometimes terrified to talk about it, but I think it needs to be talked about. Well, I'm not an MP, I'm not a public figure. I could be shut down, but that would really have an awful effect on the world." But the idea that an MP feels that she needs to be courageous to talk about this subject. And she was at an event that a friend of mine was also talking about. We'd written a paper together, and he and she and others were talking about this paper. And a Labour MP was invited, and she felt she couldn't come. She was pretty much intimidated out of coming. So we're in this funny space where we have had 50 years in Britain. I'm only talking about Britain, other countries are different, of too few children. And yet we haven't even got the debate underway to the extent that an MP can put his or her head above the parapet and say, "Let's talk about it," without getting it shot down. Certainly in the Labour Party, and even people on the right are quite uncomfortable with it. We shouldn't be uncomfortable with it. I'm happy to debate it with people. I've got a new book coming out later this year, I hope, called "No One Left," which will be on this subject. And I hope that people will read it and will debate it and disagree with me, fine, and say either I'm wrong and we're much better off with fewer people, and I'm happy to debate anyone on that, or potentially say we don't need them because of technology or immigration. And again, I think there are good arguments against that, why we do need to have kids. But I think it would be far better that it got discussed, and eventually that we get to the point where the government acknowledges, as some governments in the world have done, that we can talk about demography and that we are having too few children. And on the one hand, as I said, with 50 years we've had too few children, and we're still not at the point where we can really comfortably start talking about it without the most extraordinary things. I mean, I got all sorts of extraordinary accusations thrown at me by suggesting we need to have more children. I think it was in Vogue, they said a whiff of the black shirt, or was it the brown shirt? I can't remember. So that's just a way of shutting the discussion down, isn't it? Really?
Is that a reference to Mosley?
I don't know. I suppose it was pro-natal policies in Germany and Italy under Hitler and Mussolini. But as I pointed out, Stalin was also giving out prizes for mothers to have children. That's not suggesting. I'm not suggesting
good either.
I'm not suggesting we do that. But if you look at the people on the one-time heroes of the left, Stalin, Mao, Castro, they're all pro-natalists. And the left has suddenly decided, to be pro-natal is to be a fascist.
Yeah.
That shows no sense of history. They don't understand their Marx, because Marx was a pro-natal, very anti-Malthus, a very rich and interesting tradition of pro-natalism on the left. But the woke left has decided just to shut their eyes to that and say, if you're pro-natalist, you must be far right.
I see. So would I be right to surmise that if you do get attacked on the right, it might be that sort of fear of scroungers on benefits, that kind of thing? They're going to give extra money to those with all the kids. That feels like a right-wing reaction. And the left-wing, they are deliberately misinterpreting what you're saying so as to believe you're saying that women are recipients for babies.
Yeah, it's the handmaid's tale. So you're right on the left. On the right, I don't think there are many people attacking me on the right or attacking this idea on the right. But if you were to attack it from the right, I think the most likely way you would do it would be from a libertarian perspective, which is people must make their own choices, which I totally agree with. Government has no business to get involved at all. And I'm quite sympathetic to that because I'm from that Thatcherite generation. I remember when she came to power, I was 14 and the country was in an awful state. And we needed a more libertarian approach to the world, by which I mean a slightly smaller state, slightly less taxation, smaller state, and the state not owning all the utilities. And states, used to own BT and the railways. So that kind of libertarian right might say, this is not a business for government. Okay. The problem with that, and I've discussed this with a former Thatcherite cabinet minister, who was saying, look, if there's a shortage of labour, the price of labour goes up and the market sorts it out. What are you wittering on about? And my response to that was, that's all very well in theory if you're living in a libertarian wonderland. But in fact, in reality, if we're short of nurses, if we're short of doctors, if we're short of soldiers, if we're short of care workers in old age homes, do our right-wing politicians want to turn around and say, well, we'll just turn these things into markets, people who can pay, and people who can't pay for the healthcare or whatever will just do without. Now, we're not there. Nobody's there politically. So the state is intervening in all these areas. The state is saying we need to make sure that if you're ill, you have a doctor, that if you're dependent, you have some kind of care worker, and so on and so on, that if your kid is young, he or she has a teacher. We the state are going to take responsibility if all the railway companies break down, that there will be a railway service with a driver. In other words, we're not living in some libertarian wonderland. The state is taking responsibility for all of these things. And therefore, I don't think the state can wash its hands of the very fundamental issue of where all these workers are going to come from. Now, of course, you could say, well, with a smaller population, we need fewer workers. But the problem is, and it gets back to this problem of aging, the problem of dependency is how big is society on the one hand and how many working age people are there on the other. And we've now got to the point where we have people living longer, which is a wonderful thing, still expecting to retire in their mid-60s. And more of those people, and fewer people of an age who are paying taxes and working. So in Japan, for example, towards the end of this century, we will have barely one person aged 20 to 65 for every one person aged over 65. I don't know how. I mean, the Prime Minister of Japan has spoken of a societal collapse. We're heading in the same direction. Everyone will head in the same direction. If we have 1.5, 1.6 children per woman, never mind if we end up with a 0.8 in like they have in Korea.
Nice.
And again, something I often cite is Japan on the way up. When it reached 100 million people in the 60s, there were 5 to 6 working age people for every retiree. When it gets back down to 100 million, it will be barely 1 for 1. So I suppose, how did I get onto this monologue? It's essentially the response to right-wing libertarians saying governments have got no business. I would say that's fine if governments have got no business to provide healthcare and to make sure the economy is chugging along, et cetera, and to provide schooling. But as long as government is a player, and as long as we as a society want it to be a player because we expect so, we won't find it acceptable as a society that old people are sitting in their homes with no one to care for them. We won't find it acceptable that there's a shortage of teachers. Teachers get high wages. They're very expensive, and you can't afford it. If you can't, we're no longer providing free school education. All these areas where the state steps in and feels it needs to make provision because society feels we should be making social provision. All of these areas rely on people to be there to do the jobs.
You've mentioned myriad factors in this decline. Is it also possible it's related to, for example, a decline in drinking? People don't drink as much alcohol, maybe less sex. There does seem to be less sex. I think 1 in 3 young men are sexless now. Is that another concern?
I think I don't know about the drinking. I find that improbable, to be honest. And we know, for example, that there are still fairly high fertility rates in Islamic societies where drink is forbidden. So, I've been to Pakistan. It's quite hard to get a drink in Pakistan. You can. They've still got one of the highest fertility rates outside sub-Saharan Africa.
Interesting.
And so I'm very dubious about the drinking and some of those very hard drinking Scandinavian countries, which once had a quite high fertility rate, have got a very low one. Finland's gone through the floor. So I wouldn't take seriously the link to alcohol. The thing about sex is I think there may at root be something going on about relationships, about coupling up, about marriage, and that may be tied to sex in some way and not having many children. It's a lot of similar attitudes, putting people off having relationships, having children, having sex. But actually, you need relatively little sex to have quite a large family. So I always remember there was a film, I think it was called The Meaning of Life, back when I was in the 1980s. And there's this, and the 1980s was such a different era, but there's the camera pans. It's supposed to be set in the 20s and 30s. There's a scene, and there's all these kids coming out of a house, one after the other, and a very sort of messy, dirty house. Opposite the net curtains twitch, and this chap looks out disgusted and says, "Oh, those children, bloody Catholics!" And he says to his wife, "Every time they have sex, they have another child." And she says to him, "Well, that's like us. We've got one child." But the point is, you can have an awful lot of sex and no kids, and you can have relatively little sex and quite a large family.
There must be a correlation on a nationwide scale.
Timing, not necessarily. No, I mean, if everybody got married young, let's say, and so had relatively few sexual partners, and had sex a few times within each menstrual cycle, I don't think you wouldn't have a low fertility rate. So I'm not advocating one or the other. I'm simply saying you could have an extremely sexualized society where there is actually a lot of heterosexual intercourse and still have a low fertility rate.
I would wager that a lot, and I'm not talking about myself or anyone I'm absolutely not, but that there are a lot of couples, young couples, who are not engaging in sex 3 times each menstrual cycle, or even necessarily once or twice.
Yeah. Well, I'm 60 later this year, and I went out with on my first date with my wife in 1985. So I'm a long way from understanding the mores of the younger generation.
Computer games.
And it may be that I ought to understand them better. But, my kids, 2 of my kids are married now. My third has just got engaged. So maybe they're not, they're all in their 20s. So maybe they're not typical. And it's probably something that I should understand better. And I'd be really interested, having got this debate going, if we agree as a nation we're not having enough children, and lots of other nations do. And then I think we do need to have this discussion. Now, I've got my own theories about low priorities, as we've talked about, how that actually plays into whether or not you get married. We know half of kids are born outside wedlock. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Why aren't people coupling up? What do women say about men? What do men say about women? But I think generally, once people decide they want to have children, provided they're a reasonable age and they're in a couple, then they don't need an awful lot of sex in order to conceive reasonably quickly.
I just think maybe fewer accident births happen over an entire country.
You're absolutely right. So definitely one of the things that's pulled fertility rates down is the sort of the collapse of teenage pregnancy, all that stuff, which was not great, which was often accidental.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. That pulls it down to an extent. And there's been an absolute collapse in the fertility rate of people in their early 20s. But it hasn't been compensated for by a rise in their late 20s and early 30s. And that's the problem. So again, I'm not advocating, let's go back to the teenage pregnancy. But the fall off in teenage pregnancies, I suspect, has got, whether it's got to do with less sex or it's got to do with people being more sensible and taking precautions, I couldn't tell you, and it's a bit beyond my scope.
Yeah, I'm interested because you say Japan and Korea, they're among the worst, and I also know, those are the real video game places. They love playing their reality, virtual reality, and all those things. And I do wonder. You hear about people dying from playing so much that they forgot to eat and drink. Yeah, which reminds me of that experiment with a mouse, I think it is, where they're connected to their brain and they push a button that goes straight to their brain and it's just pure joy. Yeah, and then they don't eat or drink and they die.
Well, that's a bit like drugs, isn't it?
Oh, I suppose it is.
And I think we can learn something from societies like Japan and Korea. So when we look at ultra low fertility societies, one of the things I said is they haven't got that Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. So that's part of the story. Is there something about the way they're doing modernity? The very isolated lives people lead. I mean, I put like 20 years ago, I heard of this idea of a herbivore. It's a Japanese male who, I suppose it's like an incel, like an early version of an incel, a Japanese man who kind of retreats into his bedroom, doesn't want to see anyone, just plays video game. So I think the trends towards that and the trends towards having fewer children are in some way related, but I haven't exactly cracked how. And probably better minds than mine and younger minds than mine, more in touch with contemporary society. What I can say is we're not having enough kids, and I can talk about certain correlates, but if you get into the psychology, if you get into the youth practice, if you get into the technology that people are using, I'm a bit at sea, and I think it would be better investigated by someone who was a little more in touch with that kind of stuff than someone who was going on dates in the early 80s and got married in 1992 and is already a grandfather.
Oh, I think even despite your age, your those golden years, and I mean, you're really not very, very old, and I think you can understand. I mean,
but as we were talking earlier, I am very divorced from popular culture.
That's true. Well, it's time to have a look in. I don't know. I think it that must play some part.
I'll go and do an anthropological study among some young people
in Korea and Japan,
if I can observe them. Yeah, I was in Korea actually earlier this year, the end of last year, giving a speech in Korea, and it's very interesting. A couple of things about Korea that really mark it out. One is I talk a lot about immigration, to what extent it's a solution, to what extent it isn't a solution. And somebody said to me in Korea, "Oh, but of course we need to keep a homogeneous society." And I think it's very interesting. Korea and Japan, the idea of an ethnically homogeneous society is so taken for granted, nobody talks about it.
It's not considered racist.
It's just not even discussed.
We couldn't say that here.
Whereas in the West, even to raise it as an issue is off limits because it's unacceptable.
Yeah.
So in neither society does it get discussed. So that's one thing about Korea. And the other thing they said is, do we need to celebrate motherhood more? And I said, no, you need to celebrate parenthood more. And that gets back to what I was saying earlier about finding a way to create a pro-natal culture or a procreationist culture, which doesn't just say it's down to the women. And our demographers tend to do their analysis by woman. So we always talk about fertility rate by woman. There are a number of reasons for that. One is you always know who the mother is. So there's no two dads claiming a child or no dad claiming a child. The other thing is women's fertility is more limited in time, so we can talk about a particular cohort. Women born in 1970, say, we know how many children they had, and more difficult with men. Also, women have a more limited number. Generally, they have somewhere between 0 and I once met a woman who had 15. But men could have 0 to goodness knows how many. So we tend to express data by woman. But I think we need to be careful not to fall into the trap that just because we express the data by women, we therefore put it all onto the woman.
Yeah, that's how Boris Johnson's got away with it for so long. Nobody knows how many kids he's. I don't think he even knows.
I hope you don't think he does. No.
Interesting to know. I'd be interested to know.
Well, I couldn't possibly comment.
Something you touched on earlier was China, Japan, a lot of these, India. I think what's interesting, what I'm taking away from you and from watching you before is we, for a long time in the West, I think we're a little bit scared. Maybe we don't want to say that too much out loud, but like, we're not going to be a dominant force anymore. These countries are going to be. And it looked quite scary, like bam, bam, bam. They're like huge suddenly and they can do everything we can do and more. And now they're struggling suddenly. So is it not necessarily the case that those countries are going to become the superpowers that we all imagine they would be?
My second book, The Human Tide, talked about the relationship between power and demography. And I do think that if you don't have the numbers, you're never going to be a big power. You can have the numbers and not be a big power. So it's having a large population is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for being a big power. And I think part of the West's dominance of the world in the 19th century was the fact that it got out of the Malthusian trap. There was a huge population explosion and people from Europe could travel and move and settle the whole of the world, or very large parts of the world. And as Europeans lose that edge, as they shrunk enormously and continue to shrink, they can't be a major power in the world anymore. Who will be, I don't know. But they will need large populations in order to... So somewhere like Nigeria, for example, has got enormous potential. Whether it can realise that potential, I don't know. We know, for example, China had a massive population in the 19th century and it was still powerless. So you need to have the numbers to be a great power. But you obviously need more than just the numbers. Then in terms of are other countries in trouble, there was a point in the early 20th century in Edwardian England when the upper classes and then the middle classes were cottoning on to birth control. And so better off people had smaller families, and the working class people still had very big families. And that was the moment, interestingly, where eugenics became acceptable. And people said, oh my goodness, the wrong sorts are breeding, the right sorts aren't breeding, we need to do something. Now, I think in a way we've been through a similar position on that at a global level, whereby people in Europe have said, Europeans aren't breeding, and the rest of the world is. But actually, just as the use of contraceptives filtered down society in early 20th century Britain, and eventually everybody was having small families. So that is now, as I think I started the discussion by saying, becoming a very global phenomenon. And you're finding that fertility rates are collapsing in places like India, in Thailand. Jamaica has a much lower fertility rate than the UK, for example. Wow. The only places in the world with really high fertility, persistently high fertility, is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and even there the story is complicated. South Africa, it's gone down a lot. North of the Sahara, it's not so high. Countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, they've got a lot of momentum. They're still going to grow very big, but they're really getting their fertility rates down. Parts of Central and West Africa aren't. It's a global human phenomenon, and it's moving very, very fast. And it's no longer just a white European thing. And actually, the lowest fertility rates, as we've discussed, are in East Asia. And I think this is going to be a huge challenge to China in the coming decade.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, but they've now got to support an entire generation of older people that they can't quite be that force that I think we maybe feared over here that they would be.
Yeah, and the Chinese Communist Party is going to find it extremely difficult to change tracks, having bullied and badgered people not to have children. Mao, by the way, as I said, was a pro-natalist, and he believed that people should have large families. I'm not saying, therefore, that's a good thing, or Mao was a good thing. Quite the contrary. I mean, he was a terrible person, as were the other dictators who were pro-natalists. But I don't think we should diss pronatalism just because some bad men supported it. But once Mao and the Gang of Four were out the way, they imposed this very strict one-child policy. And now now the government realizes it's wrong and it's been a terrible mistake. And they're desperately going around trying to reverse it, but they're not going to get anywhere unless they try coercive methods the other way. Ceausescu in the 60s suddenly overnight in Romania banned contraception and abortion. And even in Romania in the 1960s, which was a pretty backward society in many ways, after a year or two of a very high fertility rate, people figured out ways around it. And I think the Chinese today, with their prosperity and education, are going to be very hard to bamboozle into having larger families than they want. Which goes back to what I said, it's about priorities, it's about what people want. It's not about forcing them. And I hope that in China they don't start forcing people.
Yeah.
One reason to be hopeful, by the way, is that people still say they want 2 to 3 children. If you actually ask people in their 20s, how many would you like? And that's something, that's a grounds for hope. That's a light at the end of the tunnel, as it were, something we can work with. And for those who are policymakers, we can say, how do we help people achieve that goal? If people on average wanted to have 1.5 children, I think the game would pretty much be up. But I think people still in theory say they want children. It's just not a high enough priority for them. That's the problem.
Oh, it's so complicated, isn't it?
Social science has always got anything at the social level is complicated, but we've got to battle our way through it and understand how we overcome it. We can't sort of throw in the towel and despair and say it's so bloody complicated.
Yeah.
There's nothing we can do about it. I think there are things we can do. There are things we can do at the personal and individual level, making our own decisions, and if we're past the age of having children, maybe helping our children have their own children, would be a more active grandparent or an uncle and aunt, be kinder to people on the tube with buggies, talk on podcasts about the need to have kids. I mean, there are all sorts of things you can do to support a more pro-natal society. But in the end, it's got to be what people want to do. It's got to be about their choices. And I would very much regret any kind of coercive force trying to raise the fertility rate in an artificial manner. I don't think it's a question of cajoling your kids to have more children. But for example, this morning, my wife was up at 7, going over to my daughter and son-in-law to look after the baby so they could have a lie-in. Well, they're more likely to have more children if they feel they've got that level of support than they're being run ragged. So that's the way to do it.
Do you do it as well?
Sometimes.
That means no. But I know, yeah. I think...
I am quite an active grandparent, but I don't get up at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning. No.
You know something, though, and this is purely anecdotal from people I've spoken to. I don't have kids myself or anything like that. But not only have I noticed that young people are talking less about wanting to have children, but also grandparents, they all want the kids, but there's a little bit more of like hey, if you think I'm going to be up at, whatever time in the morning, if you think I'm going to be over doing all this, I've heard loads of people saying that their parents are that, and that didn't seem to be the case just a while ago.
No, I've heard people say that, and that's why I think even if you're past the age to have your own children, you can say, well, let's take one cruise fewer and go away with the kids and somewhere perhaps a bit cheaper, a bit simpler, and look after it. Again, at Christmas time, we were in our house in France. My daughter and son-in-law, every morning we were up. So I was up with my grandson then, and we were letting them lie in. That's an attractive holiday for them. So I think grandparents, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, everyone can do their bit to make the burden a little lighter, which may encourage a higher fertility rate.
What a lot of people it's sort of almost a reflexive reaction, say is, well, hang on, there's not enough space. But I believe that there is. Is there enough water if we had more and more people?
The issue of resources is really badly understood. So people talk about, we're using up more than the resources of the planet and so on. It's very much a question of technology. As technology advances, first of all, space, there's plenty of space. Have you ever flown into Stansted Airport, for example? Not that far from London. Miles and miles and miles of field. And you're in the southeast. You're in the heart of the southeast of England. So there's no absolute limit to the amount of space. And I'm not saying I want to see the whole country concreted over, but there's loads more space. So that is a bit of a red herring. And in terms of resources, we were told we were running out of oil. Now we're told we can't use oil, but there's loads there. There's a huge amount of renewable resource available. And something like water, the advances in desalination, for example, have been phenomenal and is much, much cheaper than it used to be. So the great thing about people is they're very inventive. And the more people, the more brains, the more solutions. Whereas a country like Japan, as it gets older, more and more of its people go into their 60s and 70s, fewer young people going into academia generally, studying, solving problems. Aging societies will be much less good at cracking issues like global warming, like how to make better use of sustainable energy, how to desalinate water. We're going to solve these problems by brilliant young brains. And the more of those older people we have, the fewer younger people, the more we're sucking all the creativity and the energy out of young people to service the old people, the less likely we are to come up with the brilliant solutions that will figure out how we could have a few more billion people on the planet without breaking the environment.
What's the doom scenario for like the UK? What does the UK look like in 50 to 100 years in a doom scenario?
I wrote a paper on this for the ARC festival, the ARC conference, which was held in London back in early November, which Jordan Peterson and Bjorn Lomborg organised. And that paper suggests it's a trilemma, really, that we can have 2 out of 3 things, and what we choose will determine our future. So we can be like the Britain of the last 30 years, too few children, not breeding enough, not having enough kids, and at the same time wanting to fill roles, wanting the economy to grow and take over. And the only way to square that circle is mass immigration, which some people welcome, some people don't. Very rapid ethnic change, I don't think is a good thing. We've seen in Europe it gives rise to a backlash, and I don't want Britain eventually to become a country purely made up of random people from all over the world who've just come to service our old folk. That's not a model that I would welcome. And by the way, the rest of the world's having fewer kids. There won't be all that many people to come. And I think it's immoral to say we're too busy and too important to have our own kids. Let others do it, bear the cost in poor countries of educating their children, bearing the children, then we'll whip them up. So I don't think that's a solution. The second solution is the Japanese solution, which is to say, well, we want to be homogenous, so it's too late for that, but we don't want any more immigration, thank you very much. But we're not going to have any more kids. And then we will have societal collapse. We will have not enough nurses, not enough doctors, not enough van drivers, not enough plumbers. And it'll be very well for the libertarians, as I said, to say that Labour will find its price, but we will have people in dire need of workers. And I don't think AI is going to fix that, or any other technology, because there are just too many jobs that can't be done by robots or by artificial intelligence. The only way out of those two bleak futures is to get our fertility rate up. And if we did that, then we could have a society with a modest level of immigration. We are a multiracial society. That's not going to change. All our communities can flourish. We can keep a relatively stable ethnic balance between different groups without rapid change, making people uncomfortable. We don't need, therefore, mass immigration. We can keep the lights on. That is the future that I would prefer for the UK and for any other country that is today having too few children, of which we are not the worst, and in very, very wide company.
Do you know about the Fermi paradox around aliens?
I have read a book on the subject. Why, if there are so many aliens, if there are so many civilizations in the world, why haven't we met any?
Yeah.
We haven't encountered any aliens. Does that mean there aren't any?
Yeah, and there's the great filter. The idea there's something that you either have to get past. Maybe we already got past it, or there's something that every
So every civilization hit this problem. This is the problem they've hit.
Is this the one that we can't get out of? Maybe in 100 years, the whole world starts to get down to 0.5 or something, and that's it.
The reason I'm a bit suspicious of that is that I think there are always going to be societies and communities and cultures where they are having quite large families. Whether those eventually take over or not, I don't know. But
of a Hasidic Jewish world.
A community made up of Hasidim and Amish and Hutterites and maybe some of those traditional Catholics. And that we won't get there without enormous social, political turmoil. But perhaps at the end we get there, and that's what the world looks like. Or the other possibly related point is that there is a pro-natal gene. Some people think we are pronatally, that some people are disposed to be pro-natal. And in the past, there was no control over fertility, so it didn't express itself. Then there was massive social pressure, so it didn't express itself. Now, for the first time, we're in societies where not having kids is fairly normal. And therefore, that antenatal gene, pro-natal gene, the antenatal gene is expressing itself, and it will effectively breed itself out of the population. And those who do have children will be passing on a pro-natal gene. So there's a kind of cultural meme thing, if you like, that keeps it going because the culture is pro-natal.
You'd think the antenatal would be gone from the 300,000 years.
You would, but the fact is that people couldn't control their fertility. I mean, contraception didn't really exist. And only fairly recently are people who don't want children feeling free not to have them. So there's either this sort of mimetic cultural pronatalism, which will, as I was saying earlier, grow and grow and grow, have large families, keep the children within the family, and grow at 3% a year until suddenly the whole world is Amish or Hasidic or whatever, which, as I said, is going to be a strange world, and a world in which there'll be huge political change. We're not going to get there with our current political institutions. Or maybe there's a genetic answer, which is we'll go through a population winter and come out the other side with people who are genetically predisposed to have large families. But either way, I mean, the latter would suggest we will go through a very long period of very, very small populations, a period of rapid aging, a period of terrible dependency ratios. And I also think that will lead to a breakdown of political and economic institutions as we used to having them. I mean, I studied economics in the 80s, and I think we always assumed there was this growth of the population. That was sort of the if you study business, there's always this assumption markets grow. Imagine trying to run a business in Korea where or a school or a charity or any kind of institution where you know that every cohort is going to be a third of the size of the last one. Wow! In 25 years, we're down to a third.
Very optimistic point to end on. Before we I've got one more question for you, but first tell me where we can find your stuff and support you.
I am now on X, but don't post there particularly frequently, but that may change. The best thing to do if you're interested in what I do is do a search for me, Paul Morland, Morland, and you will find my website. On my website, I put all my podcasts, articles, and so on. They're all gathered there. Or if you put my name into YouTube, you'll find all my videos and talks.
Who's a heretic you admire?
A heretic I admire. I have a lot of friends who I would say are heretical, and am I allowed to have three? Or
Yeah.
I think David Goodhart, Ed West, and Eric Kaufman are three friends of mine whose out of the box thinking and brave opposition to all things woke I admire very much. And I think they're all moving the Overton window of discussion in this country. I think they're all doing a great job. So I'm always happy to give them a plug.
Well, go and follow those people, give them a plug, and also check out Paul's stuff below in the link thing and all that. Keep watching his channel. I'll put up something relevant and similar right here so you can watch it.